Several hours before filming today's video, I had a priest come and bless my home because of the content of today's video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and I'm not joking. Welcome back to the Lore Line. Based on a true story. Those 5 words complete the opening crawl of so many horror movies, from The Exorcist to the Amityville Horror, but perhaps none are so famous in their use of that phrase as the Conjuring series. Based upon the work of real-life paranormal researchers Ed and Lorraine Warren, the Conjuring franchise has grown from its humble origin as one of the better horror movies of the 21st century into an absolute leviathan in the genre. The 11 films and counting within its overall cinematic universe have raked in over $2 billion at the box office in the last 13 years, cementing its place as the most successful horror franchise in motion picture history, and in large part due to the based on a true story tagline, which follows that opening crawl of nearly every film. But the question we're asking here, the question we're almost always asking on this channel, is how true is the series to those true stories? The answer to that question is complicated, to say the least, and to be honest, it varies from movie to movie. Some, as we'll find, are total fabrications, and to the credit of the series' writers, they were marketed as such. The 2 The Nun films, for instance, take place in the same fictional universe, but don't make any claims to portray real events. Others, however, don't fall quite as neatly into either category. All 4 of the main Conjuring movies are generally based upon true events, namely the Perron family haunting, the Enfield poltergeist, the Arnie Johnson murder trial, and the Smurley haunting. But each of them takes liberties in varying degrees, to the point where it becomes difficult to separate fact from fiction. One thing that can be said for certain is that none of the films could be described as documentaries or even dramatizations of what actually happened. And that is especially true of the Annabelle story. There are, for all intents and purposes, 3 versions of the Annabelle story. The one that we're all most familiar with, at least these days, is the one portrayed in the New Line Cinema films Annabelle, Annabelle Creation, and Annabelle Comes Home. That story, however, is technically the second version, based upon a much older, more direct account presented in the 1980 book The Demonologist by Gerald Brittle, which claims to be much more than just based on a true story. Brittle claimed that his work was non-fiction, and that he used primary sources like investigative tapes and interviews with the Warrens themselves to craft his narrative. And the author even goes so far as to say that the text of this book was read for accuracy by 2 Roman Catholic exorcists. The Demonologist isn't just a book on the Annabelle story, though. It covers the entirety of Ed and Lorraine's career up to the late 1970s, including stories like the Amityville haunting, the Beckford haunting, and of course, the Enfield poltergeist, which is the subject of the second film in the Conjuring main storyline. And while I initially planned on doing a video covering all of these famous hauntings in one go, I quickly realized how daunting a task that was going to be. There is a lot of information to sift through, sources to track down, even a few calls to various dioceses that I've had to make, because the goal of this episode, and the series with which I plan to follow it, is not just to cover the on-screen versions of each of Ed and Lorraine's stories.
My goal is to give you all the third version of the story, the truth.
And while we're on the subject of the truth, I have to be honest with you, this video does have a sponsored segment. That said, we think a video about demonic possession is the perfect place to talk about another kind of possession, that being a certain kind of smoke or vapor-associated bad habit, which millions of North Americans struggle with every day. For legal reasons, we have to play around with our language, but if you've been watching the channel for a while, you've almost certainly heard us mention a company I believe to be our longest-term brand partner, Fume. And there's a reason we've been happy to work with these guys for the last 2.5 years, and it's because we genuinely support the product and the mission. In the simplest terms, Fume is an analog flavored air device intended to help you move past certain bad habits by first taking the bad part away. There's no smoke, no vapor, no electronics. Just the air you breathe, and a stick of fiber soaked in natural plant-based flavoring. And while I personally love the old-fashioned feel of the classic Fume device, this time, the guys sent us something a little bit more 21st century in appearance. It is the new Fume Zero, and at just $24.99, it is the simplest way to try flavored air. Zero nicotine, zero vapor, just natural flavor, and a better habit to reach for. If you're ready to take the first step towards breaking the habit, you can try it now via the link in our description or by going to tryfume.com/products/fume-0 or by scanning the QR code on your screen. Once again, that is tryfume.com/products/fume-0 or scan the QR code on your screen. The best-known stories about the Warrens generally take place from 1970 onward, but the best place to start most stories is, of course, the beginning, or at least what they presented to be the beginning. And according to Gerald Brittle, Ed and Lorraine's investigations into paranormal phenomena began much earlier than the decade of disco. Born in 1926 and 1927 respectively, Ed and Lorraine were only in their early 20s when they turned their attention towards the supernatural. Now, for both husband and wife, the interest started at a much younger age, though for significantly differing reasons. For Ed's part, he said he was 5 years old when he first realized that something unusual was going on in this world. This revelation came about a year after his family's landlady passed away, when he came face to face with the spiritual realm for the first time. "I was upstairs, taking off my play shoes," he told Brittle. "It was just before sunset, and as the world outside grew darker, Ed caught movement out of the corner of his eye. As I sat there on the floor," he recounted, "the closet door opened all by itself. Inside, he saw a dot of light, about the size of a firefly, which in a few seconds grew to human length, and then, incredibly, the apparition of the landlady stood before him. She appeared translucent, wore some sort of shroud, and was frowning as usual just as she looked in life. Then, as quickly as she appeared, she vanished." Lorraine's introduction to the preternatural, on the other hand, came later when she was about 12. It was Arbor Day, and as she and her classmates stood in a circle watching the groundskeepers plant a new tree on the front lawn of their all-girls Catholic school, she had a vision. "Well, just as soon as they put the sapling into the ground, I saw it as a fully grown tree. I looked up into its massive branches filled with leaves blowing in the wind, with no idea I was experiencing second sight. As she stood there looking up at a tree that hadn't yet grown, one of the nuns leaned over to ask her, 'Miss Moran, why are you looking up at the sky?' When she responded that she was just looking up into the tree, she said, the nun sternly, though more likely sarcastically, asked her if she was seeing into the future. 'Yes,' the 12-year-old clairvoyant responded, 'I guess I am.'" There were different consequences for each member of the future demon-hunting duo. Lorraine had made the critical error of saying something objectively jarring to a nun, of all people, and the result was a weekend stay at a retreat home. And while there, she said that she couldn't talk, play, or do anything but just sit there all day long in church and pray. As you might expect, she clammed up about the visions for a while after that. Now, Ed's experiences weren't quite so punitive, and that's probably because the first person he told was his Connecticut State Trooper father, who promptly told him to never speak of it to anyone ever again. As he grew older, however, he became more and more curious about what he'd seen. Even at an early age, he said, "I was trying to figure out the weird incidents of psychic phenomena I saw in my own home. One of the most perplexing things to happen to me as a child," he added, "was that I would have dreams of a nun coming to speak to me." That is something that actually did make it into the Conjuring series. We're not really going to be talking about the movies. It's kind of a staging point, but that did make it into the series. Anyway, when he once again went to his father for answers about this nun coming to speak to him, he was told that woman was your aunt, which was odd because Ed never met his aunt. She had died before he was born. Now, this didn't stop her from contacting him through his dreams, and in one such apparition, Ed claimed that she told him he would tell many priests the right road to go down, but you yourself will never be a priest. With that, he felt that his fate was sealed, and that belief only became stronger when fate brought him and Lorraine together in their late teenage years. Speaking to Brittle for The Demonologist, Lorraine said that with Ed due to ship off to the Navy to serve in World War II, the pair married when they were both 18, and that their only child, Judy, was already 6 months old by the time Ed returned home after being honorably discharged. By the way, finding Ed's draft registration card is how I learned that their names straight up were not Ed and Lorraine Warren, but actually Warren and Lorraine Miney. Nevertheless, they appeared as Mr. and Mrs. Ed and Lorraine Warren, and I have 100% confirmed these to be the same people, in a May 8, 1966 Bridgeport Sunday Post article identifying them as rather successful local artists. And that does fit with Brittle's version of Ed and Lorraine's story, because he wrote that, as Lorraine told him, the art turned out to be a stepping stone to psychic research. And according to Lorraine, we needed a subject to paint. A good subject, something people could relate to. Haunted houses, as it happened, were that subject. Ed would find a haunted house, she explained, and then we'd drive to the site in our old Chevy. Once there, Ed would sketch the house and the grounds, apparently without permission, and then offer the drawing to the almost certainly confused homeowner in exchange for stories about the haunting. If the story was engrossing enough, Lorraine added, we'd paint up the house for our collection and then sell it later at an art show. And sell they did. You know, leaving aside the fact that she said they gave the sketch to the homeowner, and that means that Ed either did 2 sketches and gave one away, or that he... yeah, it doesn't clarify how this worked. Anyway, that same Bridgeport Sunday Post article describes a sale of unusual and much in-demand paintings by Edward Warren, Stepney artist. Just on the right, on the same page, another article quotes Lorraine, reportedly the business mind behind their burgeoning art empire, as saying, I sell them as soon as they are finished, and we never seem to have enough to make a display. The business was doing so well, in fact, that the paper also reported that just back of the Warrens' home on Knollwood Road, a new studio is about ready for occupancy. Oh, and did you know that comedian Matt Rife now owns that house? Did you know that he's also claiming to be a legitimate paranormal investigator now? We gotta get better at gatekeeping this stuff, guys. You know, anyway, as I was saying, the Warrens built an art studio in the back of the house, but as anyone who's seen the films knows, it didn't stay an art studio for very long. By the late 1960s, the business of painting haunted houses and the thrill of paranormal research had merged to the point where they were essentially one and the same, with the latter becoming the greater interest. According to Lorraine, Ed essentially used the art as an excuse to conduct field research, which was something that at the time she didn't find particular interest in. But as time went on, she became more and more convinced of the existence of the spiritual world Ed studied, and she began to foster the clairvoyance she'd suppressed for so many years. Then they met Annabelle. When Ed Warren picked up the phone one dreary New England day in 1970, although to be perfectly honest, I don't know that it was dreary, I just assume it was because it's New England. Anyway, when he picked up the phone, there was an Episcopal priest on the other end of the line, something that was, at least according to Brittle and the Warrens, becoming a more and more common occurrence. This call, like so many others, was about someone who felt like they were dealing with a ghost, in this case, one that had physically attacked someone in the home. And the Episcopal Church turned to the best-known ghost hunters in the area. Would you investigate the case further, the priest is said to have asked, and, as a demonologist, recommend if any formal church action should be taken. After hearing him out, the Warrens agreed to go and take a look, and the priest provided the phone number of the 2 women who made the complaint. Now, being as the case was in Connecticut, it didn't take long for Ed and Lorraine to reach the low-rise apartment complex where the reported ghost was stirring up trouble. Ed knocked on the door, and moments later, he heard multiple locks being opened before the door swung open. Standing before him was Deirdre Bernard, an attractive but sober-faced young lady of 25. After a quick introduction, Deirdre, who was a nurse, led the Warrens back into the apartment's kitchen, where they met her roommate, Laura Clifton, also a nurse, and Cal Randall, both of whom introduced themselves but said little else. So, recognizing that the situation must be serious, Ed unpacked his tape recorder, camera, and black attaché case, and laid them on the dining table. And what followed was arguably the most famous conversation in the history of modern demonology. And really quick, I also want to say that this was the second time in my entire life that I have ever seen the word attaché written in an English language document, which, honestly, given another series we've been working on this channel, I feel very validated. People don't use that term, guys. Like, there's a select few number of people who would use that term, and foreign factions aren't one of them. People from New England and people who are high society Southerners, on the other hand. But anyway, back to that conversation I was talking about, because Ed began by saying, okay, I'd like to hear the whole story right from the beginning. Who here can tell me? Deirdre answered first, and began by saying that there are 2 stories, really. One which had to do with Cal, and the other with Annabelle. But I suppose they're both about Annabelle, she added. I'm not sure. Now, Ed and Lorraine were confused at first, largely because they'd been introduced to everyone in the room, and nobody's name had been Annabelle. Ed asked who Annabelle was, and Laura told him that she belongs to Deirdre, which only confused everyone further. After some follow-up questions, Laura pointed into the living room, where a doll sat slumped on the sofa. Seeing no living person in the room, Lorraine asked, Are you talking about the doll? That's right, Laura replied. The big Raggedy Ann doll. That's Annabelle. She moves. The dialogue here, truly incredible.
Yeah.
At that, Ed stood up and walked over to inspect the doll, which he described to Brittle as big and heavy, the size of a 4-year-old child. There's some dramatic language in there about the black, pupilless eyes staring back at him, but what we need to know is that this was just a simple Raggedy Ann doll. There was nothing outwardly demonic about it in its appearance. So Ed gave it a good once-over, then went back to the kitchen without touching it. And then the rest of the questions came. Where did the doll come from? It was a gift from Deirdre's mother. Was there a reason it was that specific doll? No, just a novelty. Raggedy Ann dolls were new at the time. When did the activity start? About a year prior, when it started to move around the apartment by itself. Now, Deirdre clarified that she didn't see it walking around, just that she would leave it in one place, and when she and Laura returned from work, it would be somewhere else in the apartment, or its limbs would be in different positions. So after being prompted to explain further, Deirdre explained that she got the doll for her birthday, and that shortly thereafter she started to notice that when they'd come home at night, its arms and legs would be positioned in different gestures. For instance, she said, its legs would be crossed at the ankles, or its arms would be folded in its lap. After a week or so, this made us suspicious. So, to test it, I purposely crossed its arms and legs in the morning to see if it really was moving. And sure enough, every night when we'd come back home, the arms and legs would be uncrossed, and the thing would be sitting in any of a dozen different postures. Laura interjected to say that the doll also changed rooms by itself. One night, they'd even come home to find it kneeling in a chair by the front door, which they found odd because every time they'd try to make the doll kneel, it would just fall over. Other times, we'd find it sitting on the sofa, she continued, although when we left the apartment in the morning, it'd be in Deirdre's room with the door closed. But that wasn't all, of course. It would leave us little notes and messages, Deirdre added, in handwriting like that of a small child. It would say things that meant nothing to us, she continued. Things would be written like, help us or help Cal, even though Cal didn't appear to be in any danger at the time, and it was one doll. So who was us? If that weren't strange enough, they also couldn't figure out where either the paper or the pencil used to write the notes came from. These notes had been written in pencil on parchment paper, but no matter where Deirdre and Laura looked, they couldn't find either of those things anywhere in the apartment. It sounds like someone had a key to your apartment and was playing a sick joke on you, Ed claimed to have said, and Deirdre quickly responded that she initially thought the same thing. So, she explained, we did little things like put marks on the windows and doors or arrange the rugs so that anyone who came in here would leave a trace that we could see. Days passed by, and the doll kept moving, but there was no sign of any intruders. And that is when things took a turn for the worse. While the doll was moving around, and we'd become suspicious of burglars, something else screwy happened, Laura said. Specifically, they came home one night to find the doll sitting on Deirdre's bed as usual, but something was off. There were red stains on the back of the doll's hand, and 3 drops of what appeared to be blood on its chest. From there, the activity began to increase in intensity, though not all of it seemed malicious. One time around Christmas, Laura explained, we found a little chocolate boot on the stereo that none of us had bought. Presumably, it came from Annabelle. When did you come to determine that there was a spirit associated with the doll? Questioned Lorraine, who, along with Ed, had been asking for clarification or prompting the girls to give more information throughout this conversation. Deirdre answered that the activity went on for about a month to a month and a half before they finally decided they were being haunted by some kind of spirit, and they sought help in the form of a medium, which was not, in simple terms, the best idea. Through the medium, the spirit explained that she was the ghost of a 7-year-old girl named Annabelle Higgins, who used to play in the fields long ago before these apartments were built. Now, however, everyone she knew had passed on, and everyone who lived there was grown up and only concerned with their jobs, so there was no one she could relate to, except these 2 young nurses. Annabelle felt that we would be able to understand her, Deirdre explained, and that's why she was moving the doll around. She just wanted somebody to play with, to not be so alone. And so she asked if she could stay with them by moving into the doll. What could we do? Asked Deirdre. So we said yes. It was at this point that Ed became concerned. Wait a minute here, he cut in. What do you mean it wanted to move into the doll? Do you mean it proposed to possess it? Deirdre confirmed, saying that it seemed harmless enough. They were nurses after all, and were accustomed to seeing suffering every day. They simply felt it was the compassionate thing to do. Lorraine then asked if they did anything different with the doll after they learned it was supposedly possessed by a little girl spirit named Annabelle, and Deirdre said they hadn't, but they did treat the situation differently now that it wasn't just a weird moving doll, but a little girl. Alright, before you go any further, let's back up a minute, Ed cut in once more. First, you got the doll for your birthday. The girls nodded. After a while, the doll began to move or at least change places enough for you to notice it. And this made you curious, so you decided to have a seance. Then a spirit came across that called itself Annabelle Higgins. This supposed little girl spirit was 7 years old and asked if it could come live with you by possessing the doll. You said yes out of compassion. Then you renamed the doll Annabelle, right? I don't know why I've decided Ed's from Brooklyn.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was like...
I kind of had like this idea that he's, this inner city cop, like Law and Order.
Yeah, this like
dealing
kind of...
I feel like he'd want people to think he was like that.
That's so valid.
Exactly. So, the girls replied that he was right, only for Ed to follow up with more questions. Had they ever seen the ghost of a little girl at any time in the apartment? No, they hadn't. Had anything strange other than the chocolate boot happened? Yes, a statue had levitated and then tumbled in the air and fell on the floor, and that one scared them. Did they think that maybe they shouldn't have given the doll so much recognition? Of course not, because it wasn't really just a doll. It was a little girl who was scared and alone, and it would have been cruel to ignore her. I mean, before you knew anything about Annabelle, Ed clarified. How were we to know anything, Deirdre replied, but she agreed that, looking back on it, they probably shouldn't have given the doll so much credence. Before they'd met Annabelle, they'd seen the doll as something of a harmless mascot. It never hurt anything, Deirdre said, at least until the other day. And now a normal person would have followed up with a question like, what happened the other day? But Lorraine went in a completely different, much more dramatic direction. Why reveal the climax to the story of how the doll sitting 10 feet away just hurt someone a few days ago, when you can instead ask more clarifying questions which make more sense in a narrative piece than in an actual investigation? I wonder. Anyway, Lorraine asked the girls if they still thought it was a little girl moving the doll around, only for Laura to reply, what else could it be? It's a damn voodoo doll, that's what it is, Cal interjected, finally entering the conversation and clearly frustrated with how naive the girls had been. I told them about this thing a long time ago, he said. I don't know why he's Southern. I don't know why I went this direction. We're having fun with it today, guys. The doll was just taking advantage of him. And with that, Ed suddenly remembered there was a third person in the room who might be able to tell him something. What had Cal experienced? Well, for starters, he sure as hell didn't like the doll, and the doll didn't like him either. The thing's got a mind, and dolls don't have minds, right? He asked. So, from the beginning, I didn't think this thing moving around their apartment was cute. Ed prompted him further, at which point Laura suggested that her fiancé tell them about the dreams, which is something that definitely should have come up earlier in the story if any of these people behaved rationally. Well, Cal began. No. We need the mood lighting. Kurt, the mood lighting. Thank you. The thing gives me bad dreams, recurrent ones. But yet, what I'm going to tell you is not a dream as far as I'm concerned, because I somehow saw this happen to me. The last time it happened, I fell asleep at home, a really deep sleep. And while I was lying there, I saw myself wake up. Something seemed wrong to me. I looked around the room, but nothing was out of place. But then, when I looked down toward my feet, I saw the rag doll, Annabelle. It was slowly gliding up my body, moved over my chest and stopped. And then it put its two arms out, and one touched one side of my neck, the other touched the other side like it was making an electrical connection. Then I saw myself being strangled. I was writhing and trying to push the doll off my chest, but I might as well have been pushing on a wall because it wouldn't move. I was literally strangling to death, but I couldn't help myself, no matter how hard I tried. Everyone, round of applause for Kurt's first mood lighting. Kurt is our new editor, taking a lot of pressure off of Thornbury. A round of applause for Kurt. Unless he did a bad job, in which case, bad Kurt. So anyway, after that explanation from Cal, Ed wanted to know if this was the physical attack that the priest had mentioned, but Cal quickly shut that down. No, he answered. That happened here in this apartment when Laura and I were alone together. It was about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and we were reading over maps because I was going on a trip the next day. Everything was quiet at the time. Suddenly, we both heard sounds in Deirdre's bedroom that made us think that someone had broken into the apartment. I quietly got up and tiptoed to the bedroom door, which was closed. I waited until the noises stopped. Then I carefully opened the door and reached in and switched on the light. Nobody was in there, except the Annabelle doll was tossed on the floor in a corner. I went in alone and walked over to the thing to see if anything unusual had happened. But as I got close to the doll, I got the distinct impression that somebody was behind me. I swung around instantly and Cal stopped, allowing his words to trail off. Laura then interjected to say that Cal didn't like to talk about that part and explained that when Cal turned around, there wasn't anybody there, but he suddenly yelled and grabbed for his chest. He was doubled over, cut and bleeding when I got to him. Blood was all over his shirt. Cal was shaking and scared, and we went back out into the living room. We then opened up his shirt, and there on his chest was what looked to be a sort of claw mark. Now, Ed wanted to see the mark, but Cal told him it was gone. As if sensing Ed's doubts, Deirdre chimed in to confirm that she too had seen the marks. 7 lines, 3 of them vertical and the other 4 horizontal. But the Warrens had more questions. Was there any particular sensation? Yes, it was as if they were burning. Had Cal ever been cut or wounded there before? No. Did he lose consciousness? No. How long did they take to heal? 2 days. Had anything happened since? No, they all replied in unison. Who had they first contacted after the incident? I contacted an Episcopal priest named Father Kevins, Deirdre told Ed and Lorraine. Why did you decide to call him instead of a doctor? Lorraine asked. And Deirdre replied, do you think someone off the street would have believed where that claw mark on Cal's chest came from? Anyway, what they were really concerned about wasn't the cuts, but where they'd come from. They figured something was wrong, and that it was something spiritual, but they didn't know who to ask. They chose Father Kevins because they knew him, and he seemed to be trustworthy because he taught at a local junior college. When he agreed to meet with them, the girls told him the whole story, and he said that he believed them, though he also said he'd never heard of such a thing happening these days. Still, they asked him what he thought was happening, at which point he said he didn't want to speculate, but he did feel it was some kind of spiritual matter, possibly an important one, and that he was going to contact someone higher up in the church, a Father Everett. That's what he did, Ed replied, and Laura took the opportunity to ask the question that must have been torturing them all through the discussion. What did they think did that to Cal's chest? Now Ed, for his part, obviously needed more information. Had anything like this ever happened to any of them before? Did the name Annabelle Higgins or even just Annabelle mean anything to any of them before the doll came? It hadn't, and it didn't. Ed went to ask a further question, leading with Cal's statement that he'd felt a presence in the room before he got hurt, but Laura was understandably at her breaking point. She interrupted Ed, insisting that there was something in the apartment, that they all knew it, and they were moving out to get away from it. But Ed had to temper their expectations. I'm afraid that's not going to help you very much, he told the girls. When Deirdre asked what he meant, Ed explained that, to put it in a nutshell, folks, you inadvertently brought a spirit into this apartment, and into your lives. You're not going to be able to walk away from it that easily. He then gave the 3 young people a minute to process that information, finally breaking the silence to say that they would be able to help. The first step would be to call Father Everett to come over. According to Brittle, Ed had no trouble getting a hold of the Episcopal priest, who had been waiting for them to telephone. And as he explained the situation, Lorraine went to the living room to see if she could discern the spirit presence that was in the apartment. Once Ed was off the phone, the Warrens both returned to the kitchen, where Ed told the girls and Cal that Father Everett would be coming over to perform a sort of blessing, an exorcism of the premises. At this, Cal exclaimed, I knew it would lead to this. Ed gave him credit for calling, but apparently felt this was the perfect dramatic moment to explain what really happened. As he saw it, there was no spirit called Annabelle haunting them, the apartment, or the doll. Annabelle was nothing but a trick, but that didn't mean there was no spirit. The manifestations, the teleportation of the doll, the mysterious notes, the blood, all of it was real, all of it was malicious. But it wasn't the work of any ordinary ghost. Ghosts, he explained, human spirits, plain and simply can't bring on phenomena of this nature and intensity. They don't have the power. Instead, what's taken over here is something inhuman. Cal, obviously unfamiliar with the idiosyncrasies of supernatural research, asked what that meant. Demonic, Ed clarified, telling the class that ordinarily people are never bothered by inhuman demonic spirits, unless they do something to bring the force into their lives. And in this case, it appeared to be that the girls had done just that. In fact, they'd done a whole bunch of things, as Ed went on to explain in some detail. And Kurt, since you got through the regular mood lighting, it's time for the spooky mood lighting. Thank you. Well, for the most part, you made honest mistakes, but in this case, you made the wrong mistakes. Your first mistake was to have given the doll so much recognition. You see, the reason why the spirit moved the doll in the first place was to draw attention to itself. And once it had your attention, it exploited you. Rather than reciprocating your care and concern, it simply brought you fear and even injury. And this is the nature of the inhuman spirit. It's negative, it enjoys inflicting pain. And right at the very beginning, you should have been intolerant of the unnatural activity. However, instead of cutting the thing off at the start, it aroused your curiosity. And in fact, got noticed, supernaturally. Your next mistake was calling a medium. Whoever functioned as the medium was unwittingly used as an instrument of communication by the entity. And during the sitting, this inhuman spirit fed you false information. The demonic is a liar. It's even been called the father of lies. Well, you were lied to by a spirit of deception. And unknowingly, you believed the lie. Your worst mistake, though, was in giving the spirit the permission it needed to move into the doll. That's what it wanted, and it preyed off your ignorance of its existence to do so. But why? Laura and Deirdre wanted to know, and Ed was happy to explain that in order to really interfere in their lives, the demonic has somehow got to get your permission to do so. Elsewhere in The Demonologist, Ed explained that during the infestation stage, the strategy is to create fear, thus generating negative psychic energy. It starts breaking down the human will. The goal, of course, being to torment the person until they can no longer resist the demon's attempts at possession. So, when they gave Annabelle permission to move into the doll, it was like handing a maniac a loaded gun. But the doll itself wasn't possessed. According to Ed, spirits don't possess things, but rather people. Moving the doll around was just a ruse to give the girls the impression that it was the spirit of an innocent little girl, so that they'd lower their guard. And when they were good and complacent, the demon would have made its move. In short, he finished, you left yourselves wide open, and the deceptive negative spirit took advantage of yous. With your permission, of course. This is how the phenomena was brought on. Now, after a dramatic pause to allow for any questions, Ed carried on, and in a way suggested that what happened to Cal might have even been a good thing. His refusal to believe the entity was just some poor lost little girl angered the demon, which caused it to lash out and attack him. Strangulation was the first attempt, and when that failed, it left behind the claw marks to send a message. Something Ed claimed they'd seen before, and something he considered a telltale sign of inhuman presence. Thankfully, the attack scared them all into action before the spirit could get its claws deep into either of the girls. You got off easy this time, he told them. Had this spirit been given another week or two, y'all might have been killed. And in a moment that almost feels as though it were scripted, Laura and Deirdre were in the midst of the classic, oh God, you're serious, aren't you, moment when suddenly the doorbell rang. It was Father Everett. The Warrens began to pack up their gear as Deirdre welcomed him into the house, and shortly thereafter, the tall, middle-aged priest strode into the kitchen. He and the Warrens had never met, and surprisingly, he was the one who seemed more nervous, and we'll get to why in just a minute. But suffice it to say, this Father Everett wasn't just uncomfortable in his role as an exorcist, as Brittle wrote. He was completely unprepared. Nevertheless, Ed gave the priest his report, which was that, in his judgment, the spirit that was responsible for the malicious activity was inhuman, that it was still in the apartment, and that the only way it could be made to leave was through the power of the words written in the exorcism blessing. It was at this point that Father Everett admitted that he was not totally familiar with demonology, and he wanted to know how Ed knew that a demon was responsible for the incidents that the girls and Cal had described. Ed, for his part, explained that, in this case, it wasn't all that difficult to determine because these spirits work in characteristic ways. Basically, at that moment, he said they were in the infestation stage of the phenomenon, in which the inhuman spirit manipulates physical objects or even causes direct harm to those in its way. Bringing the medium in had only accelerated and exacerbated the situation by convincing the girls to lower their guard, and more importantly, give it permission to move into the doll. Having obtained that permission, it no longer needed the ruse, and it changed its behavior from benign activity to malevolence. It aroused fear through the weird movements of the doll, Ed told the priest. It brought about the materialization of disturbing handwritten notes. It left a residue of blood on the doll, and ultimately it even struck the young man, Cal, on the chest with a bloody claw mark. But that wasn't all. Beyond the activity, Ed continued, Lorraine has also discerned that this inhuman spirit is with us now. Lorraine's an excellent clairvoyant, and she's never been wrong about the nature of a spirit that's present. And if all that wasn't enough to convince Father Everett, Ed invited him to go a step further and challenge the entity right now with religious provocation. The priest declined that offer and simply asked, why don't I just do what has to be done? And with that, he began to make his way through the apartment, reading the Episcopal blessing of the home in each room. While not a structured exorcism rite, the Warrens told Brittle that the wordy 7-page document is distinctly positive in nature. Instead of directly expelling the demon, it was directed toward filling the home with the power of the positive, the power of God. And I would like to take a minute because, again, I had this probably not the exact same, but the Anglo-Catholic version of this done at my home earlier today. And Anglican Catholicism didn't become its own separate church. Like the Anglican Catholic Church that I'm part of didn't become separate from the Episcopal Church until several years after all of this took place. So I would not be shocked if it was the same exact blessing, the same exact ritual. And if it was, it does actually explicitly cast out unclean spirits. There are a lot of problems with Ed Warren's demonology stuff, but we're gonna get to it, I promise. Like, if you hadn't picked up on it, oh boy. But regardless, exorcism or not, the blessing appeared to have worked, and Lorraine herself confirmed that the apartment and the people were free from the grip of the demonic presence. As a final measure, and at Deirdre's request, they took the doll with them as they packed everything into the car, and with that, the Annabelle story should have been over. As with any good story, however, that was not the end. On the drive home, Ed and Lorraine felt themselves the object of a vicious hatred. At every curve, the car would stall, the power steering would cease to work, and the brakes would fail. Something was still attached to that doll, it seemed, and it wasn't letting go of the people who had driven it from its prey. Ed managed to remedy the situation long enough to get home by dousing the thing with holy water, but it only took a few days of Annabelle being in the Warren home for it to begin acting up once again. First, it would levitate, then it would move around the house, a phantom cat would appear with it. Anytime a member of the clergy called the house, demonic growls would emanate from the shadows. As time went on, the demon's power only seemed to grow, until eventually the Warrens placed Annabelle into a special case designed to limit her powers. With that, the Annabelle story came to a close, and Ed and Lorraine were heroes once more. Or at least, that's how they tell it. Since The Demonologist was published in 1980, there have been a few retellings of the Annabelle story. As I said, the most famous is from the Conjuring series, but there were occasions where Ed or Lorraine spoke about the story during lectures or media appearances. And it's in viewing and reading those iterations that we can see the cracks beginning to form. Now, some of them are minor. For example, the book version claims the girls were 25, but in an undated interview from sometime during the internet age that was conducted by Ed and Lorraine's son-in-law, Tony Spera, Ed said the girls were 28. Similarly, while the book says nothing about the dating of the story, that same interview records Ed saying that it was 1971, while a 2014 talk by Lorraine says that it was 1970. Of course, these are minor discrepancies. This could be just time and, forgetting minor details, but other aspects are more of a problem. Off the bat, the explanation for how the paranormal activity started and what it was is completely different between the two tellings. Brittle's narrative, which presents as though it is a transcript of a taped conversation, clearly states that the initial activity was the doll changing positions on Deirdre's bed while nobody was home. In the Spera interview, on the other hand, Ed said that one morning she got this idea to bring the doll from the bedroom into the kitchen where they were having breakfast. She put it in a chair and she said, "Oh, Raggedy Ann here is going to have breakfast with us today," just kind of joking around. Ed claimed that she repeated this for a few days, but then on the third morning, the doll's arms suddenly moved as they were sitting at the breakfast table. These are two completely different accounts which don't make sense when put together. Instead, they contradict every single step of the way. I mean, remember, a big part of the version in The Demonologist is that they couldn't prove the doll was moving itself. And then in the version from the interview, they watched it move itself. And then there's the issue of the medium, or should I say the reason the medium was brought in. Brittle's version presents this as a very serious decision made in response to over a month of paranormal activity, including the appearance of the notes and the blood on the doll. But in the Spera interview, Ed says the girls called the medium the same morning that the doll first moved, and that they did it as just a joke, just a game. And this implies a change in the timeline regarding when events turned malicious, which is important because Ed's reasoning in The Demonologist was at least partially based upon the chronology. Annabelle got worse after the girls gave permission to move into the doll. But in the Spera narrative, that seance happened much earlier, and the activity took a lot longer to ramp up. It's not just that either. As I said before, the account in The Demonologist, while not explicitly described as such, is presented as though it's a transcript of a taped interview. And if that's the case, then it should contain all of the activity the girls described. But if we look at the Spera interview, things change once again. The Brittle narrative addresses 5 main incidents or behaviors, namely the doll moving on its own, the notes, the chocolate boot, the vase being dropped, and finally the attack on Cal. The Spera interview, though, goes much further, describing knocking sounds, flashing lights shooting across the bedrooms, the bed shaking, temperature drops, disembodied whispers, all things that the Warrens must have learned about during that conversation with the girls, and yet none of that is in the Demonologist. So where did that information come from, if not that interview? In addition to all of that, the narrative of the demon's attacks on Cal is also different, and again, not in a minor way. To begin with, in the Spera interview, Cal is described as being much more aggressive towards the doll prior to the attacks, even having gone so far as to tell the girls they should burn it or at the very least get rid of it. More importantly, Ed told Tony that Cal was asleep on the couch one day, and I must stress that Ed says both the girls were home at the time, when he dreamed that Annabelle tried to strangle him, and that when he woke up, there were strangulation marks on his throat, something not present in the book. Most importantly, Ed said that immediately after waking up from that dream, Cal got up, picked the doll up out of the chair it had been sitting in, and threw it across the room, telling it, "You're nothing but a rag doll, you can't hurt anyone." And then, as soon as he'd done that, 7 psychic slashes appeared on his body. Why is that important? Well, for several reasons. First of all, in the book, the strangulation and the claw marks are 2 separate events, and the latter happened late at night rather than in the afternoon. But when he sat down with Tony, Ed described it all as one daytime event. Second, the book claimed that Cal and Laura were home alone when the claw marks appeared, but again, in the interview, Ed said that both the girls were home in the apartment. And third, we have the line, "You're just a rag doll, you can't hurt anyone," which Ed attributed to Cal in the interview. In the book, however, Ed said that line was spoken by a priest named Father Daniels, and that they were in Ed's office when it happened. Just to be crystal clear, I'm not saying that in the book Father Daniels said something along those lines, but not exactly the same thing. No, it is, with the exception of one word, exactly the same quote. Not only that, but the book clearly describes how Father Daniels picked up the rag doll and offhandedly said, "You're just a rag doll, Annabelle. You can't hurt anything," before tossing the doll back into the chair it had been sitting in. So this is, point for point, the same story attributed to 2 different people at 2 different times in 2 different places. These are not the only contradictions either. The Episcopal clergy play a major role in the story, both as initiators of the investigation and as exorcists, and there are several problems related to that particular aspect. One of the most glaring is the fact that Ed gave 2 completely different names for the priest who called the Warrens in and performed the exorcism. In the book, Ed called him Father Everett, but in the Spera interview, he named that character as an exorcist named Father Richard Nolan, who himself had been called in by the High Canon of the Episcopal Church in Hartford. I want to really quickly clarify, Father Richard Nolan is supposed to be an Episcopal priest. In fact, Father Richard Nolan was a real Episcopal priest, somebody I have confirmed to exist, which I will get to this in a second, but that is not true of Father Everett's. But why is this a problem? Well, it's because I have found no evidence that Father Richard Nolan ever held the title of exorcist. In addition to that, when I called the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut, they told me they don't even have exorcists and that they never did. But regardless, even if Father Nolan performed the exorcism, who was Father Everett's? Also, what role, if any, did Father Kevin's play? I was also curious about that, so I did some digging. Remember how Father Kevin's was supposedly also a lecturer at a local junior college? Well, as it turns out, so was Father Nolan. So, who was Father Kevin? I don't want to speak about that without confirming this to the best of my ability, but I'm pretty sure all of these different priest characters are just all Father Nolan. I've spoken with the archivist over the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut, and he said he'd get back to me about whether or not Fathers Everett, Kevins, and Daniels were even real priests. Speaking of Father Daniels, he does appear in the Spera interview, though he's not named. He's just referred to as a young priest who asked if he could come over to see the doll, and instead of saying it was just a doll and then tossing it back into the chair, in the Spera interview version, he silently yoted across the room. And this is, as you might have expected, not the only contradiction with the book. While both describe Father Daniels getting into a car accident due to mechanical failures on his way home after insulting or throwing the doll, and both say that the Warrens had a similar experience with their steering and brakes failing while driving on the interstate, precisely when the Warrens had that experience changes between the 2 tellings. In the book, it happened on the way home from the Annabelle exorcism, but in the interview with Spera, Ed said that this happened in complete isolation from the doll. Instead, it just happened while they were driving on I-84 one time, and apparently this was because they had been talking about the Amityville haunting. It also needs to be pointed out that along with all of these clear contradictions between the two narratives, there are other places where we kind of have to ask questions about both Annabelle and the Warrens. For example, the 2014 talk given by Lorraine cast doubt on other aspects of the book's narrative regarding how Lorraine first recognized her abilities. Where in The Demonologist, she claimed it was Arbor Day and she was innocently looking at a tree that wasn't there, she told the crowd at her old Catholic school that she had a favorite teacher, a nun who taught French, and once told her, referring to her aura, "Your lights are brighter than Mother Superior's." The punishment also changed from a weekend at a retreat to a simple suggestion that she go to the chapel and pray about it. So again, these just aren't the same story. And when I say that, what I mean is that they are clearly describing the same event, but they're not just variations. These are different stories about the same event. And then how about that timeline on Ed and Lorraine's investigations, right? Brittle wrote that they were doing this stuff in the 1940s when they were in their early 20s. But Lorraine's own words in newspaper interviews from the 60s don't match with that timeline. Brittle quoted her as saying they spent about 5 years doing their haunted house investigations before they really dove into being paranormal investigators. The problem is that in 1966, the newspapers very clearly indicated that they were still primarily selling Ed's art, and that their occult museum was just an in-progress art studio. On top of that, the papers explicitly say that Ed spent most of the preceding 2 decades working as a bus driver. According to the Bridgeport Sunday Post for May 6, 1966, it was only after their daughter Judy got married that Ed was comfortable quitting his driving job to focus on art. And Judy got married sometime around 1965. And as an aside, I do want to point out that in the Conjuring series, Judy is inexplicably presented as a small child, when in reality she was at least 25 years old by the events of the first film. In any case, if we take Lorraine's 5 years comment seriously, then the evidence would suggest that they didn't really become paranormal researchers until the late 1960s, which makes sense considering they had a child at home until that point. Going beyond that little wrinkle in time, I think there's reason to doubt other things as well, such as the claim that Ed Warren was one of 7 North American demonologists recognized by the Roman Catholic Church, and the only non-ordained one. I have looked everywhere I can possibly think to look, and I have found 0 official confirmation that Ed was ever considered anything approaching a recognized demonologist. And I've also found that Catholics can't figure that out either. There's a bunch of Catholic blogs that are like, we investigated this and found nothing. My solution to that was to reach out to the Archdiocese of Hartford asking for clarification, but I haven't heard back yet. I'm pretty confident I already know what they're gonna say. You see, I looked back through the newspaper archives from the late 60s and early 70s, and I kept noticing something. Not a single article I could find from before 1971, and it was December of 1971, referred to Ed as a demonologist. In fact, no article about Ed Warren even contained the term demon or any precise synonyms like inhuman spirit. They all just refer to him as a ghost hunter or a paranormal researcher. But wait, there's more. Given how integral the Annabelle story is to the Warren mythos, one would expect to find at least a few mentions of her in connection to the Warrens, right? Strange, then, that there aren't any. At all. At least none before The Demonologist came out. But as I was reading through article after article, I began to notice something taking shape over the years. For instance, there was a 1971 story referencing Ed and Lorraine's investigation of 2 girls who dealt with demonic influence. There was also a 1974 article which had pictures and descriptions of a Raggedy Ann doll which is believed to be possessed with the spirit of a 7-year-old girl, and the article generally attributed the more benign activities associated with Annabelle to that doll. Finally, I came across a 1975 article which referenced an incident 2 years prior in which a woman's estranged husband came home with a doll he'd bought as a Christmas present for their 10-year-old daughter, but when the mother rejected both the man and the gift, sadly he shot her, and then proceeded to do the same to himself in the bedroom moments later. And my point in telling you this is that it seems like beginning in 1971, bits and pieces of the Annabelle story started showing up in newspapers. But they were disconnected from one another, and some of the details differed from the Warrens' narrative in varying degrees. The girls in that first article were both college students instead of nurses, both had admitted to practicing witchcraft, And these were also two completely separate cases. It wasn't two girls with one haunting, it was two separate girls with two separate hauntings. The 1974 article, with pictures of an allegedly haunted Raggedy Ann doll, doesn't refer to it by any particular name or mention any of the malicious events the Warrens claim were connected to it, and it would appear that they were letting children take pictures with it outside of its famous warded display case. And then there's the 1975 article, which tells a story involving violence, a doll, and a girl, but the girl was too old to match the Annabelle story, and she wasn't even the one who died. For a variety of reasons, none of these stories on their own can reasonably be described as the original Annabelle story. But when combined, nearly all of the elements are there. Except for the name, Annabelle. And there's one last thing I want to touch on, albeit briefly, which is the issue of possession, demonic or otherwise. I simply did not have time to dive into it for this episode, but I did notice a few red flags when it comes to how Ed Warren spoke about demons. Now, once again, there are some minor contradictions. For example, he referred to the Raggedy Ann doll in their museum as possessed by the spirit of a 7-year-old girl in the 1974 article, but in the account of the story given in the Demonologist, he explicitly said, spirits don't possess things, they possess people. And the reason I call that one minor is because it can be chalked up to journalistic error. But that wasn't really my problem. To be blunt, I don't think Ed really understood demons as they exist in a Christian context. And considering how everything about the Warrens is from a Catholic perspective, that's really important. Now, I'm not saying this lightly, but I think you can blame Ed and Lorraine Warren for the general public's very inaccurate perception of what demons even are in the Abrahamic canon. The Warrens like to use the term inhuman spirits, but there's a lot more to it than that. It seems to me that Ed, through his writings, his lectures, and his interviews, kind of changed the perception of what possession looks like to the extent that it really doesn't match with the biblical version anymore. And of course, there's movies like The Exorcist and things that can also be blamed. And to be fair, I think calling them inhuman spirits is definitely more helpful than calling them demons. But the fact of the matter is that there are, canonically, numerous different classes of inhuman spiritual beings in the Bible. And this is most evident when reading in the original Hebrew. Now, I myself can't read biblical Hebrew, but one of my favorite authors and speakers, the late Dr. Michael Heiser, could. And his book Demons has been an incredible resource over the years. To be very brief, and let me know in the comments if you want me to try and get to a dedicated video just on biblical demons sooner rather than later, there are a few important terms which refer to certain kinds of inhuman evil spirits, but one in particular is relevant to this topic. I am hopeless with Hebrew pronunciation, so I will give you the English term, and then we'll show the Hebrew term on screen. The term is knowing ones, and this is one of the few classes of spiritual entity directly described as being capable of possessing a human being. Specifically, it is a form of evil spirit which was never human and offers knowledge, forbidden or otherwise, when a medium allows the inhuman spirit in so that it can speak through the human host. From the Christian perspective, this is the kind of entity someone may be calling out to when they conduct a seance, use a Ouija board, consult tarot cards, and so on. Of course, this is absolutely the most shallow end of the pool explanation of demons as they exist in the Abrahamic canon, but in order to cover that topic in depth, I will need a lot more time, and like I said earlier, probably a dedicated video. I do plan to do a deeper study into demonology as I go through the real stories of the cases covered in the Conjuring franchise, but to be honest, I'm gonna need a few weeks before I even consider diving back into this specific series. Things got a little weird this week. I haven't slept well, the dogs are acting funny, and I'm constantly anxious in a way that I haven't been since I took myself off of Ativan. It could be purely psychological, but on the off chance that it's not, I think it's probably best that I take some time before doing the next one of these. Like I said, I had a priest come by to bless my place today, so I'm already feeling a little bit better, hoping that continues. Now, all of that said, if you like what we do here at the Lore Lodge, first of all, please subscribe, like the video, hit that notification bell. I cannot stress enough how important the notification bell apparently is to YouTube's algorithm now. Anyway, please do those things, but you can also support us directly, if you so choose, by subscribing on Patreon. It's just $1 a month, and the more of you we have over there, the more help we can hire, the more we'll be able to branch out on subject matter, and the more time I can put into making the content you guys really love, and not just the stuff YouTube wants us to produce. You get access to a number of things. Occasionally we post Liquored Lore, which is our version of Drunk History, but then we've also been posting scripts from the videos, and as of last week, and hopefully this week as well, we have been posting ad-free versions of our videos over there. That's not just no YouTube ads, that's also no sponsored. You can also check out our merch at Bunker Branding or get our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, through Tableau Roasting Company. Both are linked in the description, as our Patreon and our Discord server, which is the best place to get updates on new videos, projects, and our live shows, which run Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern unless they don't, and if they don't, we'll tell you. You can also catch recordings of the lives here on YouTube and on all podcast platforms the Wednesday after the show. And don't forget to check out our other channels like The Weird Bible, History Unhinged, and my personal channel, Aiden Mattis. Last but not least, I'd like to thank Fume once again for sponsoring this video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.